You're a teller, not a person. Remember that? Vice President Richard Coleman said it in his tailored $3,000 suit. He sneered down at Emily Carter's terminal. 40 depositors in line heard every word. Nobody said a thing. Matthew Sullivan stood by the door watching. A routing number from Richard's own VIP slip was already memorized in his mind. Richard lifted his scalding coffee. He held it over the keyboard. He tipped it slowly, letting the liquid crawl between the keys one drop at a time. Steam rose off the plastic, thin and gray. The screen flickered once. Emily didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She just watched her login freeze mid-transaction. Richard smiled like a man enjoying a private joke only he understood. He had no idea the guard by the door already knew exactly which account that coffee was meant to drown and—
Wait, rewind. A billionaire kneeling for a manager. Let's see the fallout.
The marble floor of Vanguard National Bank gleamed under recessed lighting. Matthew Sullivan stood by the lobby doors. He wore a slightly faded uniform, the fabric thin at the elbows, the badge on his chest cheap plastic. His eyes moved across the room without hurry, not scanning for threats, just watching the way money moved through the space like weather loud in some corners, silent in others. At the teller counter, Emily Carter counted bills with steady hands. Her blazer was neat but worn thin at the cuffs. She had been on her feet since 7 that morning. 3 VIP clients waited near the private consultation room, their coats folded over their arms like they cost more than the folding table Matthew had eaten lunch on the day before. Richard Coleman came through the vault corridor at a pace that made junior staff step aside. Tailored suit, $3,000, not a wrinkle in it. His hair was slicked back, catching the light the same way his watch did. He carried a stack of deposit slips loosely, carelessly, the way a man carries something he has never had to pick up off the floor himself. He dropped them, not by accident. He tipped his wrist at the last second, let them scatter across the marble, and looked at Emily. "You make $12 an hour to stand by the door guard," Richard said, not even glancing at Matthew yet. "You don't look at my VIP clients, and you certainly don't speak to this teller unless I permit it." Emily's jaw tightened. She stepped from behind the counter. "Mr. Coleman, he was just helping me pick up the deposit slips." "I didn't ask for your squeaking, Emily." Richard's voice climbed theatrical, pleased with the sound of itself. "Both of you are replaceable trash. Guard, get on your knees and pick up the rest of this paper before I fire you both right now." The room went quiet, not silent. Quiet in the specific way a room goes when everyone in it decides to look somewhere else. The VIP clients did not look away. They laughed instead, low and easy, the laugh of people who had never once knelt for anything. Matthew knelt. He gathered the paper without a word. Slip by slip, corner by corner, his knees pressed against cold stone through the thin fabric of his uniform pants. He did not rush. He did not stall. His hands were calm, level, exact. He was 31 years old. He had grown up in a house with an elevator in it. His father's name was on the building deed above the vault, on the charter in the basement archive, on the wire transfer authorization that could freeze every account Richard Coleman had ever touched. None of that showed on his face. Not one flicker. Richard smiled down at him, the smile of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose name mattered. He did not know the marble under his $3,000 shoes belonged in every legal sense to the man kneeling in front of him. Emily watched from the counter, arms crossed tight against her ribs. She had watched other guards get talked to like this before. Something about this one was different. He did not flinch. He did not perform his own humiliation for the crowd the way Richard clearly wanted him to. He simply worked silent, methodical, like a man clearing debris after a storm that hadn't reached him yet. As Matthew reached for the last slip, his eyes caught the routing number printed across the top. 9 digits, an offshore prefix, a client code that did not match any account he recognized from the public ledger. He memorized it in the half-second before his fingers closed over the paper, not because he was looking for it, because looking quietly and without permission had become the only power he had left in this building he legally owned. "Apologize," Richard said louder now, playing to the clients behind him. "Apologize to these good people for wasting their morning." Matthew stood. He met Richard's eyes for exactly 1 second. "I apologize for the delay," he said flat, even giving Richard nothing to push against. The clients chuckled again and turned back toward the private room, already forgetting the guard existed. Richard straightened his cuffs, satisfied, unaware that the countdown on his career had just quietly started. Emily caught Matthew's eye across the lobby. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Something had shifted between them, small and unspoken. The kind of recognition that happens between two people who have both learned to survive by staying quiet at the right moments. Richard walked back toward the vault corridor without a backward glance, already dialing someone on his phone, already certain the guard by the door was exactly as small as his badge suggested. He had no idea what was coming. Emily Carter's break started at noon. She carried her lunch to the small break room behind the vault corridor, a plastic container of rice and vegetables she had packed the night before. The table had one wobbly leg propped up with a folded napkin someone had wedged under it years ago and never removed. Matthew Sullivan came in a few minutes later. He carried nothing but a bottle of water and the same calm expression he wore at the door all day. He sat across from her without asking, the way a person sits when they've decided the seat is not reserved for anyone in particular. "Long morning," he said. "Aren't they all?" Emily said. She didn't look up right away. When she did, something in her face had softened just slightly, the tiredness giving way to something closer to curiosity. "You didn't have to kneel like that." Wasn't much of a choice. There's always a choice. She said it quietly, not as a lecture, more like something she reminded herself of daily. "You just made the one that kept your job." Matthew almost smiled. He opened his water instead. The room smelled like microwaved coffee and the faint metallic tang of the vault air filtering in from the corridor. Somewhere down the hall, a printer clicked through a stack of statements. "You've got rice from Delgado's," he said, nodding at the container. "Best lunch counter within 6 blocks. You know it. Everyone who's hungry enough knows it." She laughed short and real, the first unguarded sound he'd heard from her since he started this job 3 weeks ago. For a moment, the bank outside the door didn't exist. No Richard Coleman, no VIP clients, no marble floor waiting to be knelt on. Just 2 people and a table with a napkin under one leg. The door opened before she could take a second bite. Richard Coleman filled the frame, his tie loosened just enough to look like he'd been working hard instead of yelling at people. He glanced at Matthew first, dismissive, then fixed on Emily. "I need the Whitmore transfers processed. Now." Emily set down her fork. "I'm on my break, Mr. Coleman. 15 more minutes." "The Whitmore account doesn't care about your break." Richard's voice had the polish of rehearsal, the tone of a man who believed his own reasonableness completely. "These are offshore transfers. They need to clear before the wire window closes. That's not a request." "I haven't eaten since 6 this morning." "Then eat faster next time." He said it lightly, almost cheerful, the cruelty dressed up as efficiency. "This is a bank, Emily, not a cafeteria. Standard procedure, professional expectations, you understand." Matthew watched Richard's hands while he spoke, steady, confident. A man who had never once had to move fast for anyone. Emily glanced at Matthew just once, then back at Richard. "He deserves a seat at this table too," she said. "Same as anyone." Richard's eyes flicked to Matthew like he'd forgotten he was still in the room. Cute. Very cute. He turned back to Emily, the warmth gone from his voice entirely. "Your promotion review is in 3 weeks. Branch manager doesn't get there by defending the help on company time. I'd hate for something like insubordination to end up in your file." The threat landed exactly where he wanted it to. Emily's shoulders dropped, not in surrender, but in the specific way a person's body gives up ground it can't afford to defend. She looked at her rice cooling now, then back at the door. "I'll be right there," she said. Richard nodded once, already turning away, already certain of his own victory. He didn't wait for her. He never did. The door swung shut behind him. Emily stood, closed the container without finishing, and slid it into the small refrigerator in the corner. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was tight. the same tightness Matthew had learned to recognize in his own reflection years ago, back before any of this, back when he was still learning what it cost to stay quiet. "You didn't have to leave your lunch," he said. "Neither did you have to kneel." She almost smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Guess we're both good at doing what keeps the lights on." She walked out toward the counter, leaving her half-eaten meal behind in the refrigerator, the napkin still wedged under the table leg, holding up nothing but empty space now. Matthew sat alone for a moment. He thought about the routing number he'd memorized the day before. He thought about Emily's promotion dangling in front of her like bait on a hook she couldn't see. He thought about how many other people in this building had learned the same math she had, that survival meant swallowing whatever Richard Coleman decided to feed them. He didn't know yet how deep the offshore transfers went. He didn't know Emily's operator ID would soon carry weight it was never meant to carry. What he knew sitting in a break room with a table missing one leg was simple. Emily Carter had just defended a stranger in cheap polyester, fully aware of what it might cost her. She thought she was standing up for a nobody. She had no idea she'd just earned the loyalty of a billionaire. The bank closed its doors at 6. By 8, the lobby lights had dimmed to half power, the marble floor catching only a dull gray sheen instead of its daytime shine. Matthew Sullivan walked the vault corridor on his second patrol of the night, flashlight off, footsteps quiet against the tile. He knew this route by memory now. 3 weeks of walking, it had taught him where the floor creaked, where the air vents hummed louder, where the cameras covered every angle except one blind corner near the secondary vault door. He had found that corner on his first night. He had said nothing about it to anyone. A sound came from the reserve vault. Metal against metal, careful, deliberate, the sound of someone trying not to be heard and almost succeeding. Matthew stepped into the blind corner and waited. Jason Riley stood at the vault entrance, arms crossed, chin lifted, in the posture of a man guarding something important. Bulky frame, security chief badge, polished bright eyes darting toward the corridor every few seconds like he expected trouble that hadn't shown up yet. Behind him, Richard Coleman knelt at the reserve drawer. His $3,000 suit jacket was folded over a nearby cart, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands moving fast through stacks of bound cash. A black duffel bag sat open at his feet, already half full. Matthew did not move. He did not breathe loudly. He watched Richard's hands counting the bundles, counting the drawer numbers stamped on the front of the vault shelf. Reserve drawer 7. He filed the number away the same way he'd filed the routing code 3 weeks earlier. Richard zipped the duffel halfway, checked his watch, and looked up. "You hear that?" he asked Jason, voice low. "Hear what? Something. Down the hall." Jason straightened. "I'll check the floor. Check it properly this time." Richard's tone carried its usual polish, even at a whisper, even in the middle of a theft. "I don't pay you to stand here and look useless." Jason moved down the corridor, flashlight sweeping low across the floor, boots heavy on the tile. Matthew slipped back toward the security desk before the beam reached the blind corner. Careful, silent, his own footsteps measured against the rhythm of Jason's. By the time Jason rounded the corner into the main lobby, Matthew was seated at the desk again, chin dropped toward his chest, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. The posture of a man asleep on the job. The posture of a man worth nothing to anyone in this building. Jason stopped a few feet away and stared. "Unbelievable," he muttered. He nudged the desk with his boot. Matthew didn't stir. "Guy's out cold." He turned and walked back toward the vault corridor, already composing what he'd tell Richard. Useless. Asleep. Not worth the badge on his chest. Matthew opened his eyes the moment Jason's footsteps faded. He sat up slowly, unhurried, and looked toward the corridor one last time. Reserve drawer 7. 9:43 at night. A duffel bag half full of cash that belonged on paper and in law to a bank his own father had built from nothing 60 years earlier. Before he stood, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single paper clip bent slightly from days of handling. He walked the long way around toward the vault's secondary hinge, the one nobody checked because nobody thought a security guard would know where to look. He wedged the paper clip into the gap between the hinge plate and the frame, small, easy to miss. easy to find later if you knew exactly where to look and exactly why it mattered. He returned to the desk before Jason emerged from his sweep of the lobby. "Nothing out here," Jason reported to Richard back at the vault. "Guy's asleep at his post. Waste of a paycheck." "Good," Richard said, zipping the duffel the rest of the way. "Write it up in the morning. Insubordination. Sleeping on duty. Give me a reason to replace him with someone who actually does the job." Jason nodded and helped Richard lift the bag onto the cart, wheeling it toward the private elevator that led to the executive garage. Neither of them looked back toward the security desk. Neither of them noticed the guard's eyes were open now, tracking the cart's path down the corridor, memorizing the exact elevator he used and the exact minute the doors closed behind him. Matthew sat alone in the dim lobby for a long moment after they left. The building hummed around him, vents cycling the vault's reinforced door, settling back into its frame with a soft mechanical click. He thought about the timestamp now locked in his memory. 9:43, reserve drawer 7, a paperclip wedged where no one would think to look. He thought about Emily home by now, rice from Delgado's probably reheated twice already. He thought about how close she was to carrying blame that belonged entirely to the man wheeling a duffel bag through his own father's private elevator. The thieves believed the dark was their cover. They had no idea the bank's true owner could see perfectly well in it. Morning rush hit the lobby at 8:15. The line at Emily Carter's window stretched past the velvet rope, 20 people, deep coats, still damp from the rain outside. She worked fast, counting bills, stamping deposit slips, calling the next customer forward without ever raising her voice above the hum of the room. Matthew Sullivan stood near the door, watching the flow of people the way he always did. Calm, level, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Richard Coleman crossed the lobby floor at 9, a paper cup of coffee in one hand, phone pressed to his ear with the other. He walked close to Emily's station, closer than the traffic required. At the last second, he tipped the cup. Scalding coffee splashed across the counter inches from Emily's hands. She jumped back, knocking a stack of forms to the floor, customers murmuring, someone laughing near the back of the line. "My apologies," Richard said, not sounding sorry at all. "Clumsy morning." Emily grabbed a cloth and mopped the counter jaw tight, saying nothing. She bent to gather the scattered forms. In the 6 seconds her attention left the terminal, Richard slid behind the counter divider and leaned toward her workstation. Matthew saw it from the door. Richard's fingers moved fast across Emily's keyboard, entering a login he shouldn't have had, navigating a screen he shouldn't have needed. Not clumsy at all. Precise. Rehearsed. Emily straightened with the forms in hand, still wiping coffee from her sleeve. She didn't see what Matthew saw. She turned back to the counter, back to the line, back to the work that never stopped, for a spilled cup of coffee. Matthew crossed the lobby. He didn't rush. He walked the way he always walked, unhurried, deliberate, a man with nowhere urgent to be. He reached the end of the counter just as Richard straightened from the terminal, smoothing his tie, satisfied with whatever he'd just entered into Emily's ledger. "Sir," Matthew said, "this area is for staff only." Richard turned, irritation flashing across his face before the polish returned. "Excuse me. Behind the counter, staff only." Matthew's voice stayed flat, giving Richard nothing to grab onto. "I'll need you to step back around." For half a second, something flickered in Richard's eyes. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to surprise. The specific surprise of a man used to being obeyed instantly, meeting a wall where he expected none. Then the sneer came back sharper than before. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Richard's voice climbed loud enough to turn heads in the line. "I am a vice president of this bank. You are a glorified hall monitor standing by a door. Get back to your post before I have you fired for insubordination." Matthew didn't move right away. He held Richard's gaze for one full second, the same second he'd given him days earlier while kneeling on the marble floor. Then he stepped back, hands loose at his sides, expression unchanged. "Understood," he said. Richard straightened his jacket, glancing at the customers watching, playing the moment for whatever authority he could salvage from it. "Some people," he said to no one in particular, "forget their place." He walked off toward the executive office's phone, already back at his ear, already dialing the next call. He didn't look back at the terminal. He didn't need to. Whatever he'd entered was already saved, already buried inside a ledger that belonged on record to Emily Carter alone. Matthew returned to his post by the door. He thought about the 6 seconds Richard had spent behind that counter. He thought about the routing number from 3 weeks ago, the reserve drawer from 3 nights ago, and now this a keystroke sequence he'd watched but couldn't yet prove. Emily finished with her line an hour later, exhausted sleeves still faintly stained with coffee. She glanced toward the door, toward Matthew, and gave him a small, tired nod. She had no idea her operator ID now carried a transaction she'd never made a link Richard had built with 6 seconds and a spilled cup of coffee. Matthew nodded back, saying nothing. He spent the rest of his shift running the keystrokes through memory over and over the same way he'd run the routing number and the timestamp before it. Account transfer. Authorization override. A sequence entered under Emily's login while her back was turned, cleaning up a mess Richard himself had created. By closing time, Matthew understood exactly what Richard had done. He had not just embezzled from the reserve vault. He had built a trail, a fake trail, one that pointed directly at the teller with the coffee-stained sleeve instead of the man in the tailored suit. Richard smiled to himself all afternoon, pleased with his own cleverness, certain he'd covered every angle. He had no idea the guard by the door had already memorized every keystroke, every second of it filed away next to a paper clip in a vault hinge and a 9-digit number from a drop deposit slip. He thought he'd found the perfect scapegoat. He had no idea he'd just handed the evidence to the one person in the building who could use it against him. Emily Carter was called into the executive office at 4 in the afternoon. She walked past Matthew Sullivan at the door without her usual nod, her spine straight, her hands empty at her sides, the posture of someone already bracing for a blow they hadn't been told the shape of yet. Matthew watched her disappear down the corridor. He didn't follow. Not yet. Inside the office, Richard Coleman sat behind a desk too large for the room. 3 forged ledger pages spread in front of him like evidence at a trial he'd already decided the verdict for. He didn't stand when Emily entered. "Sit down," he said. Emily didn't sit. $40,000, Richard said, tapping the pages with one finger. "Missing from the reserve vault. Traced directly to your operator ID Wednesday morning, 9/17. "That's not possible." Emily's voice stayed level, but her hands weren't. "I have never touched a reserve transfer in my life." "The system disagrees with you." Richard leaned back, the picture of a man untroubled by facts that didn't fit his story. "Your login, your terminal, your fingerprints, metaphorically speaking, all over an authorization that doesn't officially exist until someone decides to make it exist. I want to see the security footage. You'll see what the bank decides to show you." Richard slid a single sheet across the desk, a confession typed in clean corporate language, a line at the bottom waiting for a signature. "Sign this, admit fault. We'll discuss whether termination alone is sufficient or whether this needs to go further." Emily stared at the page. She did not pick up the pen. "I didn't do this." "Everyone says that." Richard's voice sharpened the polish, thinning at the edges. "Sign it, Emily. Make this easy for both of us." "No." The word landed flat in the room's small absolute. Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the door and nodded once. Jason Riley stepped inside, arms crossed, blocking the exit without a word. "You don't get to say no to me," Richard said. "Not in this building. Not ever. I'll call a lawyer. You'll call from a jail cell if I decide to call the police first." Richard stood now circling the desk, slowly, each step measured to make himself larger in the small room. $40,000 is a felony, Emily. Grand theft. Do you understand what that means for a woman with your kind of resume? No family money, no lawyer on retainer, just a signature away from disappearing into a system that doesn't care what really happened. Outside, through the cracked door, Matthew Sullivan stood with his shoulder against the corridor wall, close enough to hear every word, far enough to stay unseen. His hands were still. His breathing was slow, deliberate, the same rhythm he used to hold when his father's board meetings ran past midnight, and patience was the only tool left in the room. He heard Emily's voice again, quieter now, but not broken. "I want a lawyer. I want to see the footage. I'm not signing anything." "Then we do this the hard way." Richard's tone had lost its polish entirely, now thinning into something colder. Jason, escort Miss Carter to the lobby. Take her badge. Call security downstairs to prepare an incident report for the police. Jason stepped forward and took Emily's badge from her lanyard, his grip firm, his eyes not quite meeting hers. Emily let him take it. Her hands were shaking, now small tremors she couldn't fully hide, though her chin stayed level, her spine still straight. "You'll regret this," she said to Richard, quiet, almost gentle in how certain it sounded. Richard laughed, short and dismissive. "I doubt that very much." Jason walked her out through the side corridor, past the cracked door where Matthew stood close enough now that their eyes met for half a second. Emily's face carried no plea in it, no request for rescue. Just exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion something like disbelief that the world could tilt this far this fast over a coffee stain and 6 stolen seconds at a keyboard. Matthew watched her disappear toward the lobby. Behind him in the office, Richard straightened his ledger pages, satisfied, already moving on to whatever call came next on his schedule. Matthew stood alone in the corridor for a long moment. He had spent 3 weeks memorizing timestamps and drawer numbers, watching quietly, waiting for a moment that made sense. He understood now that moment had passed him by while he was still deciding to wait. Emily Carter was walking toward a police report for a crime she had never committed, and every card he'd been holding close to his chest since the day he took this job suddenly felt too slow, too careful, too late. Richard believed he'd found the perfect scapegoat, tidy and disposable, a name to attach to $40,000, so his own hands stayed clean. He had no idea he had just handed the undercover billionaire the exact rope he would use to hang him.
Real talk. Pause. A corrupt manager framed a kind teller to protect his theft. If that were me, I'd have broken my cover right there. Imagine having billions in leverage and forcing yourself to stay silent just to build the perfect trap. Let's keep watching.
Jack Sullivan waited in the underground garage beneath Vanguard's headquarters, a private space 3 levels below the visible parking structure, accessible only by a keycard few people in the building even knew existed. His car idled nearby, silent, the driver standing well out of earshot near the elevator. Matthew Sullivan arrived without his uniform for the first time in 3 weeks. Dark jacket, no plastic badge, no faded polyester. For a moment, standing in the concrete quiet of the garage, he looked exactly like what he was. The son of the man who built this bank from nothing 60 years earlier. "End it," Jack said before Matthew had even closed the car door behind him. "Tonight. Not yet. Emily Carter is sitting in a holding room right now, accused of a crime she didn't commit because my son decided to play security guard for 3 weeks." Jack's voice stayed even, but there was iron underneath it. The voice of a man who had built an empire by never raising his tone and never needing to. The press gets one whisper of embezzlement at Vanguard, and every account we manage starts asking questions we can't afford to answer. I know what's at stake. Then you know this ends now. Matthew shook his head, slow, deliberate. If I break cover tonight, Richard walks free on a technicality. No documented chain of evidence, no paper trail that survives a lawyer worth his hourly rate, just my word against 3 weeks of him building a case against Emily instead. Jack studied his son for a long moment. Whatever he saw in Matthew's face, calm, unshaken, exact, seemed to cost him something to look at directly. How long? 48 hours? 48 hours? Jack repeated flat, testing the weight of it. And if it takes 49, it won't. Matthew's voice didn't rise. It never did. I have the timestamp from the reserve vault. I have the routing number from the VIP slips. I have the keystroke sequence he used on Emily's terminal. What I don't have yet is the authority to freeze his accounts without exposing the bank to a lawsuit that costs us more than Richard ever stole. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere above them, through several floors of concrete and marble, Emily Carter sat stripped of her badge, waiting for a fate she didn't deserve, unaware that the outcome of her entire future was being decided in a parking garage by 2 men in a car. "Your mother warned me," Jack said finally, "that letting you take this job would end with you standing in a garage asking me for something I can't easily give." She wasn't wrong. Jack reached into his jacket and produced a slim black case. Inside sat a single keycard platinum unmarked except for a small chip embedded near the corner. Not a duplicate, not a copy. The master override the one card in the entire Vanguard system capable of freezing any account, any terminal, any vault door instantly and without a warrant. This traces back to me the moment it's used, Jack said. Every swipe, every second it's active. I know. If this goes wrong, it's not just Richard who goes down. I know that too. Jack held the card a moment longer, weighing something only he could see. Then he placed it in Matthew's palm. 48 hours, he said again, not 49. Matthew closed his fingers around the card. It was heavier than it looked, cold against his skin, colder still against the memory of a cheap plastic badge he'd worn every day for 3 weeks straight. Thank you. Don't thank me. Jack's eyes held his son's for a long beat. Emily Carter is sitting in that room because of a choice you made. Make the next one count. Matthew nodded once and stepped back from the car. The driver moved toward the door, ready to take Jack back up through the private elevator, back into a world of boardrooms and quarterly reports where Richard Coleman's name was still for another 48 hours listed in good standing. Alone in the garage, Matthew slipped the platinum card behind his cheap plastic ID, tucking it flat against the back where no one would think to look. 2 pieces of plastic, one worth nothing, one worth everything pressed together in the same badge holder. He walked back towards the elevator, toward the marble lobby above, toward a job that paid $12 an hour and a woman sitting somewhere in this building who had no idea the ground beneath Richard Coleman's feet had just started quietly and permanently to shift. Armed with the keys to the kingdom, the security guard walked back to work to dismantle a king. The lobby filled fast once word spread. Employees drifted from their desks under the pretense of errands. Clients paused near the entrance instead of leaving, drawn by the particular gravity of a scene about to become spectacle. By the time Jason Riley walked Emily Carter back through the front doors, close to 40 people stood scattered across the marble floor watching. Emily's wrists were free, but only for now. 2 uniformed police officers waited near the reception desk, arms crossed, patient in the way people are when they believe the outcome is already settled. Richard Coleman stood at the center of the lobby like a man taking a curtain call. This woman embezzled $40,000 from this bank, he announced loud enough to reach the back wall. Vanguard has a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Guard. He turned to Matthew Sullivan. Cuff her. Now. Matthew didn't move. The room noticed the stillness before Richard did. A few heads turned. Emily's eyes found Matthew's across the floor, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. I said cuff her, Richard repeated, sharper. No. One word, flat, final. Richard's face went through its usual sequence, pale first, then a slow flush climbing his neck. His jaw locked. His hand, still holding a set of plastic zip cuffs meant for Matthew to use, trembled slightly at his side. You're refusing a direct order. I'm refusing to cuff an innocent woman. The lobby had gone fully silent now. Not the practiced quiet of a workday. Real silence. The kind that presses against the ribs. Richard stepped closer, close enough that Matthew could smell his cologne, expensive, sharp, chosen to intimidate. Do you understand what you just did? You're finished. Both of you go to prison. Her for theft. You for insubordination and obstruction. He reached forward and ripped the plastic badge from Matthew's chest. The clip snapped. A small sound. It seemed to echo anyway. You're fired, Richard said, voice cracking, now the polish gone entirely. Get out of my building. Matthew said nothing. Emily's face crumpled just slightly, the first crack in the composure she'd held since the executive office. Matthew, she said, quiet, meant only for him, even in a room full of people. I'm so sorry I ruined your life too. Not because she believed it fully, because in that moment, watching a man lose his job for refusing to hurt her, it was the only true thing she had left to say. Matthew looked at the badge in Richard's hand. Cheap plastic cracked now at the clip. He looked at the officers by the desk already stepping forward. He looked at Emily, wrists still free, but not for long, her whole future collapsing into a single afternoon over a crime she never committed. He said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, because saying it now in this room with only Richard's word against his would accomplish nothing at all. One of the officers took Emily gently by the arm. Gone. All of it. The job. The cover. The 3 weeks of quiet patience. Not yet a small voice in him said. Not ever said the silence that followed it. Richard watched the officer lead Emily toward the door, satisfaction settling over his face like something warm. He turned back to Matthew, victorious, already composing the story he'd tell the board about the guard who tried to interfere. "You should have just done your job," Richard said. Matthew met his eyes. He didn't answer. Somewhere in his jacket, tucked flat behind the cracked plastic badge Richard now held in his fist, a platinum key card sat exactly where he'd placed it the night before. Richard had no idea it existed. He believed the man in front of him had nothing left. No badge, no job, no leverage. The officers moved Emily toward the entrance. The crowd parted for them without a word. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a junior teller who had watched the whole exchange lowered her eyes, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze, saying nothing, doing nothing the way most people in that lobby had learned to do for years under Richard Coleman's authority. Matthew stood alone near the door where he'd first knelt 3 weeks earlier. He had built this moment carefully, timestamp by timestamp, keystroke by keystroke, and it had still arrived faster and uglier than he'd planned for. Emily was seconds from a police car. His own badge lay crushed in his enemy's hand. Whatever came next would have to come fast, and it would have to come from somewhere Richard couldn't see. Richard reached for the plastic badge one more time, turning it over in his fingers, already savoring the memory he'd tell later. He had no idea he was holding the pin of a live grenade. Richard held Matthew's cracked plastic badge up for the crowd, turning slowly, playing to the audience like a man accepting an award. "This," he said, "is what happens when the help forgets its place." A few of the VIP clients laughed the same easy laugh from 3 weeks earlier, the laugh of people who had never once knelt for anything. Emily stood between the two officers near the door, her face pale, her eyes fixed on Matthew across the lobby. Matthew reached into his jacket. His fingers found the platinum card behind the broken plastic cool against his skin, exactly where he'd tucked it the night before. He pulled it free and held it up steady, silent, letting the light from the lobby ceiling catch its edge. Richard's laugh died in his throat. "That's a Vanguard MasterCard," he said, quieter now the polish gone. "Where did you get that?" "It's mine." "Impossible." Richard's voice climbed again, but the certainty had drained out of it. "That card doesn't exist outside the executive tier. You stole it. Security." Nobody moved. Not the officers, not the crowd, not Jason Riley, who stood frozen near the reception desk, uncertain for the first time in 3 weeks which direction his loyalty was supposed to point. Matthew walked toward the nearest terminal, unhurried the same pace he'd used every day at the door. He swiped the card. The screen lit instantly, cycling through authorization tiers Emily had never even seen mentioned in the employee handbook. "This is theft," Richard said. "This is a federal offense." The doors at the front of the bank opened. Jack Sullivan walked through them. He wore no coat despite the cold outside and moved through the lobby with the unhurried gravity of a man who owned every marble tile beneath his feet. 2 federal auditors flanked him, folders in hand, badges already out. The room went still. "Son," Jack said, one word. The whole lobby heard it. Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at Matthew, then at Jack, then back at Matthew, running the math too slowly, arriving at the answer several seconds after everyone else in the room already had. "Freeze the Coleman accounts," Matthew said, still at the terminal, voice flat, unbothered. "All offshore transfers. Reserve Drawer 7 authorization. Terminal login theft under Emily Carter's operator ID." The screen blinked. A soft chime confirmed the freeze. Richard's hand shook. The plastic badge fell from his fingers, clattering against the marble, small and cheap, and suddenly meaningless. "This is a mistake," he said. I am a vice president of this institution. Not anymore, Jack said. The federal auditors moved past Richard toward the vault corridor, one of them already speaking into a phone, the other opening a folder thick with printouts. Jason Riley took a step back from the reception desk, putting distance between himself and the man he'd guarded a duffel bag for 3 nights earlier. Emily watched from the doorway, the officer beside her no longer holding her arm, no longer certain what his job in this room even was anymore. "Wait," Richard said, panic creeping into his voice, now the rehearsed calm from 3 weeks ago completely gone. "This whole system is rigged. She gets everything because courts always side with this, isn't I didn't." Nobody finished his sentences for him. Nobody needed to. Matthew stepped away from the terminal. He crossed the lobby toward Emily, past Richard, past the officers, past the VIP clients who had gone very quiet, very fast. "Are you all right?" he asked her. Emily stared at him, the platinum card still visible in his hand, the badge on the floor behind him, the federal auditors moving through the vault corridor like they owned it. Because in every way that mattered legally, the man standing in front of her now did. She started. "This whole time you were." "Later," Matthew said, gentle, the first softness in his voice all week. "Right now, I need you to know none of this was ever your fault." She nodded, unable to speak, watching Richard being escorted toward a side office by one of the auditors, his $3,000 suit suddenly looking like a costume instead of a uniform of power. Jack approached his son, glancing once at Emily, then back at Matthew. 48 hours, he said. You had 6 to spare. I like margin. Behind them, one of the auditors emerged from the vault corridor holding a small evidence bag. Inside it, a single bent paperclip pulled from the secondary hinge of the reserve vault door. Tampering evidence, the auditor said, holding it up for the record, matches the timeline in the reserve drawer logs. Richard, being led away, saw the paperclip and went pale in a way that had nothing left of theater in it. He had never noticed it in 3 days of using that vault. He had never imagined a guard he considered beneath his notice would think to leave it there in the first place. Matthew watched him go, saying nothing. His silence no longer a survival tactic, but simply the truth. The ink on the account freeze was already dry. The accounts belonged for now to no one. And the man who had once sneered at a $12 an hour guard was walking out of his own bank as nothing more than a trespasser. The federal auditors sealed off the terminal Richard had used, wrapping the keyboard and monitor in evidence tape, while a third auditor photographed the screen from 3 angles. The lobby, usually alive with the churn of customers and clerks, had gone quiet in a different way now. Not fear, attention. Richard Coleman sat in a small side office. His tie loosened, his hands folded on a table that suddenly felt much smaller than the desk he'd sat behind an hour earlier. Jack Sullivan stood across from him, arms crossed, saying nothing. Matthew stood near the door. "This wasn't just me," Richard said, his voice thin now, stripped of every ounce of polish it once carried. "Jason knew. Jason stood guard. He's the one who watched the corridor." Jason Riley, brought in to confirm the timeline, stood near the wall with his hands clasped in front of him, saying nothing to defend himself and nothing to condemn Richard either. "He told me to check the perimeter," Jason said finally. "I never touched the vault. I never moved a single bill." "You knew what was happening?" Matthew said, not unkindly, simply stating it. "You reported me asleep at my post because he asked you to." Jason's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. Out in the lobby, the VIP clients who had laughed 3 weeks earlier at a security guard on his knees now stood near the reception desk, watching the same marble floor host a very different kind of kneeling. Richard had not been asked to kneel. He didn't need to be. His posture had already folded into itself, shoulders, low hands, trembling slightly against the table. Matthew pulled a printed sheet from the folder one of the auditors had handed him. The routing number from the dropped deposit slips, the reserve drawer timestamp, the keystroke log from Emily's terminal. 9-digit offshore code. Matthew read aloud, flat and even. Client designation matches an account you registered under a shell entity 6 months ago. Reserve drawer. 7:9:43 at night. $40,000 removed and logged as a transfer authorization under Emily Carter's operator ID entered 6 seconds after you spilled coffee on her station. Richard said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the numbers hadn't already said for him. You built this like it was clever, Matthew said. It wasn't, it was just cruel. Jack stepped forward. Escort him out. Matthew looked at Jason. You do it, Jason blinked. Me? You followed his orders for 3 weeks. Follow mine for 5 more minutes. Jason hesitated, then crossed the small room and took Richard by the arm, the same grip Richard had once used to threaten Emily with unemployment and prison in the same breath. Richard flinched at the touch, some small part of him still expecting deference that would never come again. They walked him out through the lobby in full view of everyone who worked there. The clients from Chapter 1 stood near the door, silent now, watching the man who had once called Matthew replaceable trash get walked toward the exit by his own security chief. Richard's $3,000 suit was damp under the arms, sweat soaking through fabric that had never once in the 3 years he'd worked at Vanguard been asked to do honest labor. You'll regret this, Richard said, weak now, the threat carrying none of its old weight. I know people, I have connections. This bank needs me. The bank needed $40,000 back in Reserve Drawer 7, Matthew said. It got that back this afternoon. It doesn't need you. The federal auditors met them at the door, handcuffs ready, the paperwork already filed. Richard's hands shook as the cuffs clicked shut, his eyes darting once more toward the crowd, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding none. Emily stood near the reception desk, watching in silence. She had gotten her badge back an hour earlier, along with a formal written apology from the bank's compliance office, though no piece of paper could fully undo the fear she'd carried in that holding room. Richard's eyes caught hers as the officers led him past. I never meant, he started. You meant every word, Emily said, quiet, final. Every single one. He had no answer for that. He was walked out through the same doors he'd once made Matthew kneel in front of past clients who no longer laughed past a marble floor that had never once cared whose feet stood on it. Jack turned to his son once the doors closed behind the auditor's car. It's done. Almost, Matthew said. He looked across the lobby toward Emily, still standing near the counter she'd worked at for 3 years, still wearing the same worn blazer, still carrying herself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught his attention on his very first day. Richard Coleman had lost his career, his stolen wealth, and his freedom in the space of a single afternoon, a cost that matched almost exactly the harm he'd tried to inflict on a woman who had done nothing but defend a stranger over a shared lunch. He had demanded the whole building bow to him. He never once imagined his authority came with an expiration date and that it had just quietly run out. By 6 that evening, the police cars were gone and the auditors had taken their evidence boxes with them, leaving the lobby of Vanguard National Bank empty, except for a handful of staff finishing paperwork and the low hum of the vents cycling through the vault corridor. Matthew Sullivan crossed the marble floor toward Emily Carter, his footsteps unhurried, the same pace he'd carried through every one of the last 3 weeks. Emily stood near her counter badge, reinstated blazer still slightly worn at the cuffs. She watched him approach with an expression that hadn't fully settled yet, somewhere between relief and disbelief. So, she said, billionaire, guilty. You knelt on this floor. She gestured at the exact spot near the door. For me, while owning the whole building. I needed to know if you'd still see me, Matthew said once the badge came off. Emily looked down at her hands at the faint coffee stains still ghosted into one cuff. I don't know how to talk to you now. 3 weeks ago you were a guard eating lunch with me because the table only had one wobbly leg. Now you're still the guy who liked the rice from Delgado's, Matthew said. That part didn't change. From the mezzanine above, Victoria Sullivan watched her son cross the floor toward the young teller who had defended him with nothing to gain and everything to lose. She said nothing, her silence its own kind of blessing, the same quiet authority she'd carried through every one of her husband's boardrooms for 30 years. I hid the money, Matthew said, because I wanted to find someone who valued the man in the cheap uniform, not the name on the building, not the accounts, just the man who showed up every day and did the work. You could have just told me. Would you have believed me? Emily thought about it, really thought about it, and shook her head slowly. No, I would have thought you were another Richard playing games with people who can't afford to play back. That's why I didn't tell you. She reached out and took his hand. Not because she had to. Just because it was true the same way it had been true 3 weeks ago when she stood up to a vice president over a shared lunch. Neither of them could really afford to lose. Her fingers were steady against his warm despite the cold marble floor beneath them both. I want you to have Richard's office, Matthew said. Branch manager. And effective tonight. Matthew the First. You've been running this floor for years without the title. The bank just finally caught up to what everyone already knew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the platinum key card, the same one his father had handed him in the underground garage 2 nights earlier. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it the same way she'd once closed her hand around his during a quiet lunch in a break room with bad lighting and worse coffee. Emily stared at the card, then at him, then at the lobby around them, the same marble floor, the same VIP consultation room, all of it hers now in every way that mattered. This isn't charity, Matthew said. You earned it. You just earned it before anyone was watching. Somewhere near the entrance, a junior teller swept up the last stray deposit slip from the morning rush, the same kind of slip Matthew had once knelt to gather while a room full of wealthy clients laughed. Nobody laughed now. The floor was quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm finally clears. Victoria descended from the mezzanine and crossed toward them, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Emily Carter, she said, I've heard a great deal about you today. All bad, I'm sure, Emily said, still catching her breath from everything that had happened in the last hour. All true, Victoria said, which in this family counts as a compliment. Matthew watched his mother shake Emily's hand, watched the platinum card catch the last of the evening light through the lobby windows, watched 3 weeks of silence finally give way to something that didn't need to hide anymore. He thought about the day he'd knelt on this same floor plastic badge cracked against his chest, certain he was giving up nothing that mattered. He hadn't known then that the woman defending him would end up holding the keys to the very kingdom he'd been hiding inside. Emily squeezed his hand once firm, certain. Guard, she said, a small smile finally breaking through. Or should I call you something else now? Matthew's fine, he said. It always was. The marble floor Richard once ruled from behind a tailored suit now belonged to 2 people who had never once needed the suit to prove anything at all.
This story is fiction, but the arrogance of unchecked power is very real. My patience would have snapped on day 1. Have you ever had a manager treat you like you were invisible, only to realize they needed you? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where the invisible people finally win.